A quick overview of these events, since this is the first one of the year. This was an idea that we had last year in an effort to sort of bridge some gaps between our faculty and our undergrad students. As you may or may not know, our professors do a whole lot more than teach. They do some pretty exciting research, and believe it or not, they were once undergraduate students just like you. And we thought that since lots of students, regardless of their major, tend to feel a little bit of, what am I going to do with this degree? We would show you some great examples of what some folks in our department have done with their degrees. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Professor Hilbink, who will talk a bit about her history as a political scientist and as a researcher. Feel free to post any questions you have during her presentation in the chat. We will have time for a Q&A at the end. But if as you're going, you just need to jot something down so you remember it later, feel free to do that. And I'll make sure that we get those questions answered once we get to the Q&A portion. So with that, have at her, Professor Hilbink.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of this beautiful fall day to tune into this Faculty Friday presentation. I'm delighted to be here to tell you a little bit about who I am, what I research, and how I got here. As those of you who've taken my classes know from my first day introductions, I, like you, did my undergrad degree at a big public research university on the other side of the Cheddar Curtain, Madison. And while I was inspired by my experience there to become an academic, I have to say that I largely had no idea what or how my professors researched or what they otherwise did outside the classroom. So I hope that this session today will take a little bit of the mystery out of that for you, at least for one professor in our department. And I hope that you will attend future sessions or watch the two that were recorded last year from Professors Tim Johnson and Tanisha Fazal to hear from other colleagues. And I do want to say I'm going to try to talk for half an hour or less and leave plenty of time on the end for whatever questions that you have. But as Lydia said, if you have a question as I'm going along, feel free to put it in the chat. And if it's kind of, it's urgent, or if she thinks it's urgent, she can stop me. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen. Here we go. I don't know why it's not coming up yet. It worked in rehearsal, right, Lydia? Huh, weird.
It sure did.
Huh. Okay, I'm gonna try again. Maybe I clicked the wrong screen for sharing. Okay, hold on, I'll try this one. I don't know why it's not doing it now. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. You guys can see that now? Okay, cool. All right, so to begin, I want to tell you a little bit about my scholarly identity and my motivation. So I am a comparative political scientist and a scholar of human rights. In political science terms, my work centers on the question of how a democratic rule of law is constructed and maintained, and more generally on understanding the roles that law and courts play in bolstering, deepening, limiting, or even eroding democracy. In human rights terms, I seek to better understand when, how, and why human rights standards embodied in international treaties and in many cases in domestic laws are met or impeded in practice. In Latin America, my region of specialty, these questions have been of central concern for social scientists, legal scholars, and citizens since the 1980s and 90s, when so many countries in the region emerged from brutal dictatorships that had systematically violated rights. I began my graduate studies at the crest of this so-called third wave of global democratization. And in Latin America, the human rights movement played a powerful role in that democratization process. I wanted to understand how the demands of that movement could be institutionalized, how concern for the equal dignity and rights of all persons could become more central to political debates and processes. For Latin Americans especially, but not exclusively, understanding what impedes or enables judicial independence and effective and equitable rights protection is of more than just theoretical interest. My work thus speaks to both academic and policy debates in Latin America and beyond. Indeed, as I seek to drive home with my students, and so those you guys have already heard this, we in the United States have so much to learn, not just about Latin America, but from Latin America. Okay, so now let me flesh this out a bit in terms of my research trajectory. In the first phase of my career, I focused on the question of how to build more rights protective judiciaries that could contribute to the construction and maintenance of a democratic rule of law. Although I certainly don't believe that courts have the exclusive or primary responsibility for upholding human rights, to the extent that human rights principles are embodied in law, many people turn to courts seeking remedy when their rights have been trampled. So I've always been interested in understanding the conditions under which judges are willing and able to offer remedies to people who come to them with rights claims. For many years then, I focused on the institutional side of the rule of law in Latin America, examining the origins and consequences of judicial behavior with an eye to contributing to insights for reformers. Engaging with a political science literature that was originally developed around the US Supreme Court and that frequently attributes judicial behavior, sorry, I tried to take out the animations, but they're still in some of the slides. This literature that studies judicial behavior on the US Supreme Court frequently attributes judicial behavior to factors exogenous to courts and the law. That is, to the attitudes that judges bring to the bench that are formed and around things that are independent of law, their political preferences or policy preferences, or considerations about kind of their power, whether it's institutional or advancing those preferences in the strategic interplay with the other branches. So SOP is separation of powers approach. So my work has offered empirical support for the proposition that formal rules and informal norms that are internal and particular to courts and the law shape and constrain judicial conduct by giving content to judges' identities and preferences. Otherwise put, my work challenges theories, the ones that you see there, on the slide, that explain judicial decision-making as the product of externally determined attitudes and calculations. And I argue for the relevance of historically shaped and institutionally cultivated identities and norms. So my first book, based on my dissertation, was Judges Beyond Politics and Democracy and Dictatorship. You see it on the left there. That's the Cambridge University Press edition, available in Kindle, as you can see on Amazon. And then on the right is the translation that I was actively involved in that came out in 2014. It was like 7 years later. but has a much nicer cover. And gave my book a new life in Chile and in Latin America, which was great. But this book demonstrates how the understandings and incentives transmitted and enforced within the judiciary in Chile committed judges to an ideal of judicial apoliticism. And I argue that this rendered them unequipped and disinclined to assert themselves in defense of rights and rule of law principles under both democratic and authoritarian regimes. So here's a little fun political cartoon that is actually from Chile, although I pasted in the flag at the top there. That's the picture of the front of the courthouse that's actually here on the cover of my the English version of my book, and showing, right, how justice came out quite beaten up certainly during the authoritarian regime. So I invoke a variety of comparative examples in the book, and I suggest that judicial assertiveness in defense of rights requires that the political nature of the judicial role in upholding a democratic rule of law be professionally recognized and institutionally supported. So that's really complicated. And if I had the whole time, we could just tell you more about my book and the argument there, but I'm happy to take questions about it in the Q&A. So subsequently, I embarked on some comparative work on judicial behavior in Spain and Chile, seeking to illuminate what I've called the origins of positive judicial independence. So that is, when will judges, there's arguments about what gives judges formal judicial independence, de jure judicial independence, protections for tenure, for salary, for budgets, those kinds of things. But just because those things are protected, and just because there's not active intervention on the part of other branches, doesn't mean that judges will necessarily stand up for rights when people come claiming violations. And so I wanted to understand when they would. And one thing that was interesting to me was that in Spain, this had started even under a regime, the Franco regime, that was, in fact, Pinochet modeled his regime after the Franco regime dictatorship in Spain. And for a long time, right, there was sort of very similar passivity, right, and capitulation to the dictatorship. But in the early 70s and through the transition, then judges actually started asserting themselves and participated actively in the transition to democracy. That was not the case at all in Chile. So I was really fascinated by that and wanted to understand it. So I spent time in Spain researching the role of there's a Judges for Democracy Association. It grew out of this organization. You can see named there, Justicia Democrática. Now it's Jueces para la Democracia. And I wanted to understand where they came from and what the consequences were of this kind of mobilization and activism from within, right, within the judiciary. And I examined its link to the links of Judges for Democracy to parallel groups in Italy, France, and Brazil. I've continued to work on that in the background since then. And I remain fascinated by the origins and consequences of judicial activism in the name of democracy. And just as an aside, probably many of you are aware, just paying attention to the news and what happens in the United States, is that frequently judges are criticized for being, right, stepping into the political thicket. And so they're supposed to, right, all the justifications, and the key to judicial legitimacy is to show that they're in fact, completely apolitical, completely above politics. And so in this case, the Judges for Democracy associations in Spain and elsewhere are directly challenging that and saying that, no, we have this important role to play in upholding democratic and rule of law principles. So I'm interested in looking empirically at what happens then, right? What are you can debate it in the abstract, but it's very interesting to look at what's actually happened in countries where you've had this kind of mobilization within the profession. So, oh, and here's just one of my articles about, it was a chapter in this book, but I decided to put the cover because, again, it's a really cool cover. I didn't edit this volume, but one of my articles on Justicia Democrática appears in this volume, and of course, you have the Goya painting on the front there. So, thought I'd share that. But meanwhile, because of this interest in issues of justice and democracy in Spain, I forged a relationship with Professor Ofelia Ferran in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at the University of Minnesota. We organized an interdisciplinary conference on mass graves and transitional justice, out of which grew an edited volume titled Legacies of Violence in Contemporary Spain. That came out in 2016, and there's a picture of me and Ofelia and our colleague. He's a forensic anthropologist, Francisco Ferrandis, who came to give a talk at the University of Minnesota. That looks like 2017 there. So anyway, my single authored chapter in this volume analyzes divergent outcomes in legal accountability for authoritarian era human rights abuses in Spain and Chile. In other words, it was work that speaks very directly to debates on transitional justice. So I just step back for a second and say, looking at Justicia Democrática and the Judges for Democracy organizations, in that case, right, judges were out in front of judges in Chile, right? And the judges in Chile were sort of the conservative ones in the comparison, right? But in terms of transitional justice, judges in Chile eventually came to, and this is something I cover in my first book, to invoke, right, to protect rights, right, to invoke international law, and eventually to try. They didn't convict Pinochet. He got off on for reasons or medical reasons. But the Spaniards, right, think that Chile, well, that Chile's the greatest example, right? They've actually dealt with these massive violations from the past, and in Spain they haven't. And so that's what I do in this volume, is to really look at the comparison between Spain and Chile with kind of like, okay, what made that possible in Chile versus Spain, where it didn't happen. So this work speaks very directly to debates on transitional justice, that is, to the factors that advance or impede accountability in the wake of massive human rights abuses. And as I mentioned, so as I mentioned earlier, through all of these institutionally focused works, examining the origins and consequences of judicial behavior, I've sought to contribute insights for institutional reformers. And I am proud to have been consulted on and have had my work referenced in judicial reform debates in Latin America and beyond. And I realized that I should have put up that's the sort of findings or insights from that chapter in the volume with Ofelia Ferran. Okay, so several years ago, though, and recognizing that these formal institutional changes focused on judges and other operators of the justice system, even when successful, and there have been reforms in Chile and Spain and different places, don't necessarily translate into greater public support for the courts. In fact, right, public trust in courts or confidence has declined quite dramatically in the two cases. So I began to shift my lens then from the strictly institutional perspective to the societal perspective, inquiring into the ways in which citizen perceptions of justice system legitimacy and capacity are formed, transmitted, reproduced, or changed. And I was especially interested in how these perceptions inform behavior of average citizens around legal norms and institutions. So since 2017, under the auspices of the Human Rights Initiative here at the University of Minnesota, I've been engaged in collaborative research, exploring the origins and consequences of low public support for justice institutions in Latin America, and especially their implications for access to justice. So now I'm going to go off script and just try to explain to you this research. So this is kind of my current research. So the original research was driven by a need to, or a puzzle that emerged because the dominant logic that has driven justice sector reform, whether in Latin America or other places, is that if you invest money in institutional reform and if that works and it improves institutional performance, and the question is, well, what does that mean? How do you measure it? But let's say judicial independence indicators go up, judicial efficiency in terms of processing cases, or rights protection within the judicial process is improved. There's been a number of different kinds of reforms in Latin America. And in Chile, the case that I know best, these have been quite successful on their own terms, right? And yet, the argument is, or the assumption was of reformers that, well, if the institutions improve their performance, then public perceptions and trust should also improve. They should be positive, thumbs up. And then that in turn will, people will feel comfortable and confident about turning to judicial or justice system institutions when they experience a harm or a rights violation or have a conflict or whatever it is, right? So it's supposed to be this kind of positive cycle. One could imagine they have a good experience, that there's evidence of institutional performance, and then you get this sort of positive feedback loop. But in fact, we know, and I mentioned before, that in fact, that first link in the chain is not valid, right? That even where you've had improvements in institutional performance, it has not necessarily produced improvements in public perceptions and trust. And so the question that we went into this with was, what are the effects then on behavior, right? Just sort of people then decide, well, these institutions are such crap, right, that I'm not going to turn to them. It's not worth my time, or it's not, it's too costly, whatever. And so I won't get treated well, whatever it is. And so instead, either I'm going to live with injustice, right, sort of a form of resignation, which is a problem from a human rights perspective, certainly. Or in some cases, people might engage in some kind of personal vengeance, right, engage in vigilantism or violence. And so, this is really what we went in trying to understand. A lot of the literature, and I'm not going to go into the whole background of the literature in political science and socio-legal studies, says that this is key, right? And that if it's positive, if you have positive perceptions and trust, that you'll get that engagement. And when trust goes down, it should ring alarm bells, because you're going to have this exit of average citizens. Another question that we had for this research was, how do structural inequalities play in, right? And so a lot of the literature argues that there's kind of two possible effects. One is that people who are in marginalized or vulnerable groups are going to have more negative perceptions of the justice system. And so then, right, that gets to this question from the previous slide, or just, right, that those structural inequalities will lead directly to a tendency to withdraw or to engage in vigilantism kind of independently of the level of trust. So to test this, we did focus groups in Medellin, Colombia, and Santiago, Chile. And we chose those two cases because they're cases which have had a real improvement in an investment and an improvement in institutional performance, but that those have not translated into trust. In fact, trust in the institutions has declined dramatically. And so we conducted focus groups. It was a very, I mean, I don't know of any other works in political science or even elsewhere that have done this kind of comparative focus group method, where we used a very similar recruitment tool, and we tried to get groups that were homogeneous within the countries in terms of gender and class, race in Colombia, and age in Chile. Age is an important variable there because of the transition from Pinochet from the dictatorship. And we then applied the same instrument in the two countries and compared through qualitative analysis and through a qualitative analysis tool called In Vivo, to understand, right, what were the connections, where did the perceptions come from, and what were their effect on both hypothetical behavior and reported behavior. So this is in an article which finally came out this past summer in Comparative Political Studies. This research showed that across social categories, people were inclined to turn to the state to make rights claims, even if they didn't expect it would produce a satisfactory outcome. So, and I should say, this slide doesn't actually say it, but one of our main findings was that trust, right, sort of depending how you want to, usually political trust or institutional trust is measured in terms of confidence, right? That's the kind of question they ask. One could debate whether that's an accurate, what's a good proxy for trust in an institution. But everybody, it didn't matter what their socioeconomic or other demographic background was, had very, very poor opinions of the justice system in their country. And yet, right, they were still inclined to turn to the state to make rights claims, even if, right, they didn't think that it was going to produce a satisfactory outcome. In many cases, they thought it absolutely would not, but they felt that there were other reasons to turn to the justice system to make rights claims. And incidentally, I mean, in this paper, especially as a political science paper, we are talking about turning to institutions as a form of political participation, right? So usually political participation scholars study voting, or they study participation in protests, sometimes petitioning government in different ways. And we think this is kind of a subset, rights claiming in the justice system, of that kind of petitioning of the government. So, but one thing that this sort of major difference in between the two countries is that Colombians in marginalized groups had notably higher levels both of rights consciousness. So when we would pose, we never used the word rights. We would pose hypothetical situations and then let them talk about it, and you know, what they would do or what they had done if they experienced, etc. And the Colombians used rights language all the time. They're very aware of it, and they knew also about how and where to seek remedies in a way that the Chilean counterparts did not. So the wealthier Chileans did, but the poor Chileans did not. But in Colombia, even the more marginalized groups were very clear on what their rights were and where they should go. That didn't mean that they necessarily thought it would work out, but they knew, right, that they could go and claim their rights. And in both countries, there was a sense of like equal democratic citizenship, and so that they should go do that. Or that they, you know, were inclined to do it, even if they didn't think that it would work out. So based on this, we argued that political context shapes people's identity and capacity as legal agents, especially among those in marginalized populations. And there's just at the bottom of the slide, there's some arguments about, what might explain this difference. We weren't actually testing for that in the focus groups. But we kind of speculated that it had a lot to do with the fact that Colombia had a constitutional transition, very rights focused, in 1991, and Chile was still under the 1980 constitution that was written by the leaders of the military regime, and was very much designed to kind of, not everybody's on their own, right, under this kind of neoliberal model. They're not seeking to build citizenship and encourage people to think about and act on their sense of identity as rights bearers. So I know I'm running out of time, so I think I'm going to kind of skip ahead. So I'll just let you know what I'm actually right this second focused on in my research. It has to do with the constitutional transition in Chile. So you can imagine, like this, we did this research in 2017, 2 years, and are like, gosh, the Chileans, right, are just kind of left high and dry. They don't understand their rights. They don't know where to turn, unless they're already kind of members of the I don't know, upper middle class or elites. And then you have this social explosion in Chile in October of 2019. And so suddenly it's like, wow, right? It's major change in context. And of course, then the pandemic came and things slowed down. But eventually this past summer, we got funding. And with Valentina Salas, who's a PhD candidate in our department, who is herself Chilean, we designed and implemented a survey that was trying to test some of our findings from the focus group research, but also looking at kind of like this new context and and if people had participated in the constitutional process, and if that could be correlated with their kind of self-reported understanding of rights, or their tendency to claim rights in the event of their violation. So I'm going to skip over these slides, but I'm happy to talk to you at any point. The main take home, and these are all slides from a presentation that we did at the APSA conference, which was actually our presentation was on October 3rd in Seattle. And what's really interesting with this quantitative data, so we had 1,067, it was a nationally representative sample in Chile, 1,067 respondents. And what we found is socioeconomic status does not determine the proclivity to demand a remedy in the hypothetical event of a rights violation. So that is actually supports what we found in our focus group research. But also self-assessed knowledge of where to turn is the single biggest, has the strongest effect, and it's very robust across different models. I'm using all the statistical language there, but it's not a byproduct of socioeconomic status, right? So people, whether or not people think they know where to turn if they experience discrimination or they experience police brutality, matters a lot to whether they are inclined then to make a claim in the event of a rights violation. So what we concluded there, and this kind of relates to, we're still framing this in human rights terms, is that, so if the supply side in terms of, right, that's what I studied earlier in my career, and certainly in access to justice, a lot of times it's focused on, oh, we have to build more courts, we have to provide resources, transportation, translation, and all those things are important. So we're not trying to say, no, that's not important. But we think that also, even if you had a perfect system, and there's a lot of investment today in digital platforms for access to justice, it doesn't matter if the people don't have the kind of rights awareness and an ability to know where to turn and how to navigate whatever kind of system is being offered to them for access to justice. And so what we've been working on, and we have some more kind of applied projects that we've been doing in Chile, is, what kinds of policies or programs can come either from the government or from NGOs that will give legal empowerment to citizens so that they know where to turn. And we're thinking of it also in this moment of constitutional change in Chile in terms of citizen empowerment also. So, yep, I think I'm gonna end the show there. And what time? Let's see. I wanted to say just a couple things about how I got there. So I've showed you all of this. So I told you I went to Madison. And I think I'll just say 3 points really quick, and that I won't go into detail. But one is that substantively, my trajectory through undergrad and from undergrad to grad school and beyond has been anything but linear. So I don't want you to think that somehow, right, I knew what I wanted to do the day I walked in to Madison, or the day I declared my major or something, which incidentally wasn't political science. It was international relations, which is basically like global studies here. Although I got into it because I took a comparative politics class my sophomore year that I just adored. So anyway, I'm happy to talk more about that, but I don't want anybody to think that, you have to know and you have to be on the straight shot from day one. The second thing is, having said that, right, I do think I was always drawn to teaching and learning. I once told somebody that, right, the reason I became a professor is because I wanted to be a student my whole life, which is kind of what it's like, right? You get to read, you get to think, you get to write, you get to debate. I mean, it's, it's great, right? Living sort of in the world of ideas. But I kind of had to fight. I mean, at Madison, so it was back in the 80s, they were sort of grooming me for like international business or something. I was studying Chinese. That's another part of the nonlinear story. And so anyway, yeah. So it was sort of like having that, like keeping that passion, right? That's like a constant, I would say, even though I had this very circuitous path to where I am now. And then finally, because I research law in courts, I work with lots of lawyers, and a lot of my students are aspiring lawyers, and I write lots of letters for law school applications. But I've never went to law school. And I had somebody the other day asking me, well, do you ever regret that? Or do you wish you'd gone to law school? And I kind of have mixed feelings, right? So like studying human rights, and with feeling sometimes I can't, right? I can't be of direct help to somebody in a situation where they're having their rights violated, right? And that sometimes is frustrating to me. And it's in those moments, especially, that I wish I did have a law degree. But I also hear from a lot of people who do have law degrees that say, oh God, no, it was, sort of not a waste of time, but it was like in order to get that license, right, you have to go through so much with a lot of people who don't care if you're motivated to do, I don't know, immigration law or human rights law or any kind of public interest law. That's kind of not how the system is really set up, right? And both in terms of the content of what you have to study, the kinds of people that go to law school and what they're interested in for the most part, and then how much it costs you, right? So anyway, I'll stop there, and I welcome your questions.
Yeah, feel free to jump in, anybody. It doesn't look like we received anything through the chat. So feel free to just unmute yourself. We just got one in the chat. So yeah, but feel free to use the raise hand function or anything like that, and we'll make sure to get to you. Good point, Filson. Research influences the policies and law that lawyers operate on. So if you really think about it, the lawyers answer to you.
Maybe, right? So yeah, and I mean, what's interesting in Chile, right, is that so I'm this outsider that's come in and analyzed their system, and I mean, they don't really care if I'm a lawyer because I'm not right? I'm certainly not a Chilean lawyer, right? And so it's really gratifying to me that my work there has been read and debated and has had some influence, right, in discussions about reforms there. And actually, just earlier this week, one of my colleagues there was inviting me. She said, we're organizing through their university in Santiago, kind of study groups around access to justice. And they said, we don't want you to come or these study groups to focus on issues where we're just discussing amongst ourselves. We want to invite representatives to the Constitutional Convention and also, right, in wider society to start thinking about, right, some of these issues now in access to justice, and to really have some kind of, the word in Spanish that she uses, incidencia, like influence in the process. And like, that's thrilling to me, right? That I could have any small role to play at all in helping to improve access to justice and justice in general in Chile.
Go ahead, Telson.
Hi, I was going to ask, you mentioned that you had studied Chinese and you're kind of being pushed towards international business in that regard. And I think you've mentioned before that you not in this like presentation or whatever, but I've obviously taken a couple of your classes. You've been to China, studied like, that realm. How did you transition from studying there and studying their, political sphere to studying Latin America?
Well, so that transition happened before I went to grad school. So it's probably a little bit harder, but not impossible once you get to grad school. And the thing is, if you decide to do a PhD, and you shouldn't go to a program that doesn't fully fund you, because you don't make necessarily a ton of money when you become a professor. But they usually, right, our department, for example, our program fully funds students for 5 years, right? But that's not very long. And you have to to get done with your coursework, your exams, and do your research and write your dissertation. Usually people get some outside funding, and it maybe 6 years, 5 years probably is not the average or the norm, but you're constrained in that regard about how much you can change once you get in. And again, I mean, it doesn't mean you have to even apply to grad school knowing exactly what you want to do. You do have some wiggle room. But my personal transition in terms of the region of the world that I was studying and the language came before. So I did go on a 1-year program. I think it was supposed to be a master's program through Johns Hopkins SAIS in Nanjing. And I was in China for 6 months after, sort of the year after I graduated from undergrad. And it was then, and that's a whole nother story, but that I decided that I wasn't going to take that path for the rest of my life. And so then I took a couple years in between that and applying to grad school, even though I sort of knew that I was going to eventually apply to grad school, to figure out, right, well, what do I want to do? I want to keep studying the same thing, but just in a different region. And that's kind of what I thought. I mean, I studied political economy and international political economy of China, right, and kind of the East Asia. And obviously I went in a really different direction after I got to grad school, but I did come around to an interest in Latin America and started to learn Spanish before I applied. So yeah, I think sometimes you need to allow that. I think allowing time between undergrad and grad can be valuable in that regard, because, you can figure out what you don't want to do as much as what you want to do. Right? I see Angel's hands up.
And we had a question in the chat actually from Lydia, what led you to choose Chile as your country of focus over other countries in the region?
Yeah, so the Chileans ask me that all the time. They assume that I must have some family tie to Chile or something, and I don't. It was kind of so once I was interested in human rights, in citizenship, and I was in a program, UC San Diego, the PhD program, or the department in general is very institutionalist focused. And so I was first kind of interested in social movements and, kind of a more anthropological or sociological focus, which some political scientists do, and I am doing now, I think. But in my program, it was really not very possible. And so anyway, so I sort of, was like, well, do I want to stay in political science? Do I not? And then I figured, sort of dawned on me, I think I TA'd for a con law class or something, like, oh, I can do courts and I can study this by looking at an institution, right? And so, but then there was no literature on courts in Latin America. I mean, almost none, right, from a socio-legal perspective. And so I had to go with what was kind of so my advisor, who was a Chilean expert, right, so that had something to do with it too, but he's like, go find what you want. And there was this really interesting debate going on in Chile. It was just sort of early post transition from the dictatorship, on what to do with this judiciary that had been complicit in human rights abuses. So I came back and I told my advisor, like, well, I found this and I found this, but there's this debate going on and about, and to understand what should be done, you have to understand why it happened in the first place, right? And so that was what I sort of, proposed in very vague terms. And he was like, that's great, do that. Right. And I had never been to Chile. I'd been to Argentina, I'd been to Central America, I'd been to Mexico. And so it was kind of, fortuitous. And it took some adjustment when I got down there. I mean, Chile was still, in those first years after the transition, it was still, people were still living with a lot of fear and kind of the very inward habits that they'd acquired under the dictatorship. And so, but I don't regret it at all. I love Chile.
And Jill, go ahead with your question.
Hi, Professor Hilbink. I just wanted to ask about the Democratic judges and how does that play out in the reality of court cases and human rights violations? Like, is it one of those situations where the judges say, yes, we're going to protect your rights, we're going to do all these things, but then they don't really fall through with the justice aspect of it, where, like in Colombia, where people are able to say, okay, yeah, we know where to go, we know who to get in contact with, but then they know that they're not going to get the justice that they're really looking for. It's just going to be pretty like low level minimum. Is that the same thing that happens with these places that have like these Democratic judges, or is it a little bit different?
So that's a great question. And that's kind of what I, skipped over it pretty quickly, but I have a book project where I'm trying, it's kind of been long delayed because there's been so many other projects that I've gotten involved in, especially coming back to Chile as opposed to staying in Spain. But that's what I wanted to understand is like, well, does it really make a difference, right? So they have this rhetoric and they, publish things and they intervene in public debates, but do actually in their decisions, do you see a difference, right? So I'm assessing that, and there's definitely, I mean, then you get into all this kind of method of how you figure that out, where the data, compiling a data set for all that. That's part of another reason why I have not yet finished that book project. But my analysis does show that judges who identify with Judges for Democracy have been involved in more cases that were making rights claims, sort of positively taking stands in defense of rights in cases that came before them. So it's a little bit complicated sometimes, like in some of these civil law countries, so not common law like we have in the United States, where there's a constitutional court that's separate from the ordinary judiciary. And so, the ordinary judges don't always have direct constitutional jurisdiction. And so, for example, in Spain, the way that I had to analyze this is looking at cases in which judges stop the proceedings and actually send a constitutional question to the constitutional court. And sort of asserting, so in that case, they can't rule on it themselves because that's the the way the system is set up, but they can make a case to the constitutional court why, that this particular case before then involves a constitutional rights violation. So, and it's the same thing in it's thinking about Colombia. I mean, the Colombian Constitutional Court has been very progressive, if you will, activist or active in promoting social rights legislation in particular, and kind of pushing the envelope of what the kind of black letter constitutional law says. And so in Colombia, it's almost like I think judges are sort of overwhelmed with rights claims under the tutela, for example. But there's, justice and access to justice and rights protection and equality, all those things are obviously more complicated and go beyond just very particular constitutional rights claims. So anyway, it's just kind of to say, I think it's a question that is an empirical question as you posed it, but that is hard to give a kind of definitive answer to, because in order to study it empirically, you have to break it down and you have to adapt to very particular questions or very particular cuts at it. So the final thing I would say though is that it also kind of depends on the right. So like I mentioned in Spain, the judges, I think in terms of the rights that are in the 1978 Constitution, have been very good, right? The Judges for Democracy about trying to advance those and trying to, make those meaningful, not just sort of on paper, but in practice or in action. But looking back, right, on sort of transitional justice questions from the Franco era, there have even been a number of judges who identify with Judges for Democracy who kind of refuse to go there, right? And so it's this kind of interesting combination, whereas, as I mentioned in Chile, you've almost had the reverse, right, of kind of judges not pushing the envelope in terms of ordinary constitutional rights, but responding to demands for retrospective justice or justice for violations that were under the previous regime.
And we have just a minute left, and we have one more question in the chat from Alana Miller. Have you ever done any research comparing any aspect of Latin American countries to the US, or do you strictly focus within the Latin America region?
So great question. And one of our goals with this project on rights claiming and kind of access to justice is to bring it back home, right? And we just, my collaborators and I, in fact, Janice Gallagher is a professor at the university at Rutgers in Newark. And she got a grant from Newark to do focus groups. It's sort of very similar to what we did in Colombia and Chile in Newark. But it took, I don't have time to go into details, but I'm happy to tell you more about it, Alana, separately. But absolutely, and I would love to be able to do something equivalent in the Twin Cities or in Minnesota as well. And I think we need to stop kind of thinking that, well, yeah, there's one thing that happens south of the border and north of the border. We function really differently, because I mean, I don't even think I have to say that anymore. It seems pretty obvious.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hilbink, and thank you all for attending. Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and tell everybody that if they have any other questions, they can follow up with you directly at hilbink@umn.edu. Yeah, and I hope you all had a great time today and learned a lot, like Lisa said at the beginning, that you learn, she does a whole lot more than teach, right? She's doing some exciting stuff. So yeah, and yeah, we've got more on the docket next month. November 19th, I believe, we have Professor Michael Minta coming in. And so he'll share some of his research as well. So feel free to come back. We'll have more information about that in the coming weeks. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks for coming again.